You're listening to Breaking BizDev with John Tyerman and Mark Wainwright. Conversations that break down, beat up, and redefine business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. And now for your hosts, John and Mark.
Welcome, business developers, to another episode of Breaking BizDev. I'm John. As always, I'm joined by my trusty co-host, Mark. Mark, how you doing this morning?
John, I'm well, thank you. For those of you who are just listening in, John has his new uniform on, which is his Breaking BizDev trucker's cap. We'll talk about this in another episode. I think recently you went to a conference or something where people were commenting on your hat. So I love it. I'm failing on the branded end of things. I know that you sent me a T-shirt a while ago for Breaking BizDev across the chest, and I love it. I think it's so much fun. Who knew? Right? Who knew we'd have all this fun stuff going on? But yeah, we've really enjoyed it. And it's just another way for us to put a brand out there and have people be more comfortable and, on our topic du jour today, familiar with our brand. So this is a good episode. And I think this is maybe a little bit less about Mark and John are going to talk about a specific business development concept that people are going to kind of use in their marketing and selling, but there's an idea here that we want to get across that is kind of, like you've said earlier, that is across all marketing and selling. It's just this really important concept that we want to talk about, and it keys off of that word familiarity.
That's exactly right, Mark. And we're going to have to get you more swag so that you can wear different kinds of hats. You like the dad hats, right?
I'm a dad hat guy. Yeah.
So we're going to get you a dad hat. And if anyone listening wants some swag, reach out to Mark or and we'll get you hooked up.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, we're going to talk about the mere exposure effect. Some people refer to this as the familiarity bias. And so that's what we're going to break down today. What is it? Why is it effective? How can you use it in your marketing, your sales activities? And then we've got a pair of guest voices that we're going to bring for your listening pleasure. We've got Melina Palmer, who is the host of the Brainy Business podcast. And then we have Ryan Paul Gibson, who is the founder of Content Lift. He is the customer interview guy. So stay tuned for that. That'll be at the back half of this episode. So, Mark, should we open the box here and dig into the mere exposure effect?
Yeah, right. We got to start at the beginning, John.
Yeah.
That's like, what the heck is the mere exposure effect? And this is one of those things that is screamingly obvious to many people out there, as are a number of these cognitive biases that, we experience either with people that we are working with or whatever, selling to, marketing to, whatever else, or that we are experiencing ourselves, and maybe we're aware of it, maybe we're not. But these cognitive biases are everywhere, and this is one of the mere exposure effects. So yeah, let's define it. I know you pulled out your Webster's dictionary or something like that. So what do we got?
I did, and I liked this definition from Simply Psychology. The mere exposure effect is a cognitive bias where individuals show a preference for things they're more familiar with. It goes on to say that repeated exposure to a stimulus increases liking and familiarity, even without conscious recognition. So you like it, You're more familiar with it, you like it even though you don't know it. And then essentially, the more we encounter something, the more we tend to prefer it based on familiarity alone.
Yeah, based on familiarity alone. So there's this unconscious interaction that's happening. There's some quantity or some frequency of interaction that all of that leads to some increased preference, tendency, whatever else. And that flies in the face of what many experts out there in professional services firms believe, which is they will be selected by a prospective client because of their expertise.
They will be sought out because of their expertise.
Right. But lo and behold, there's a bunch of stuff at play, not the least of which is what we're talking about today, is this mere exposure effect. It's just people's maybe even unconscious familiarity with them.
Well, and I think there's a lot of research also that goes into even complex decisions are made with emotion and justified by logic.
Yeah.
So if we wander into why this cognitive bias, why this is effective to use in your marketing and sales strategy, is because it boils down to, I hear this all the time from marketers and business developers and accounting in architecture and engineering. Our industry is about trust. Winning new deals is about trust. And so if building trust is kind of that end goal, or that the objective of your business development activities, then let's reverse engineer that a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, before someone trusts you, they've got to like you. Before they like you, they've got to know about you.
Yeah.
Before they know about you, they need to be introduced to you and become familiar with you. And that is the kind of that stepping stone to trust. It starts with being exposed for the first time. So here we are.
Right. We're going to hit the head on this nail again and again, John, because it's just not the sort of default thinking of most experts in expert firms. Right.
We need to create exposure for the mere exposure effect.
Yeah, right. People need to understand that, this is not a nice to have. This is not an, oh, by the way, it would be really convenient if they were more familiar with us and our brand and our expertise and everything else. Is like, this is a have to have. Like, this is a critical component that individuals and firms, organizations out there can leverage to build this strong foundation of familiarity, on top of which you can build your case for, your expertise and your experience and all those types of things. So that's great. And it's worth noting, as this little asterisk aside, John, one of the core reasons why you and I got together and started this podcast in the first place was for you and I to establish ourselves and become visible experts in this world of, crazy professional services, marketing and selling. So, if people are scratching their heads as to how this plays out and what it means and what it looks like, everything else is what looks like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, well, let's break it down. So, what are the keys to leveraging this mere exposure effect? How do we take this concept and how do we put it into practice? And Mark, you alluded to what we're doing with this podcast, and the very first bullet point that I have here is consistency, right?
Right.
And so we publish an episode of Breaking BizDev every other week. We've got bonus episodes we throw in here and there, but that's largely our schedule that we've stuck to for almost 2 years now.
Right. Yes,
so that is a critical part of it.
Yeah, that's the quantity part of it, where you start building this quantity, and not quantity for quantity's sake, right? It's got to be good stuff. People who engage with you in one way or another, it needs to be of value to them. So you and I work hard to make sure that the stuff we cover is relevant and important to people. But yeah, it's this quantity and cadence thing, is that you need to find the right cadence. I feel like we've done a decent job of that. And so, we start walking up those stair steps towards, like you said, that trust thing. And we start building this cadence, these interactions with people. Sometimes we're just, the voices in people's heads as they walk their dog. Sometimes people, see us on little clips on social media, on LinkedIn. Other times people will want to watch these on YouTube. But yeah, we've created a number of different ways that people can start to establish familiarity with us, because no one's going to want to listen unless they start believing and trusting in what we say. So we start these little baby steps with these every other week little voices coming into your head, and then people start believing actually what we're saying.
Well, and it's not just the every other week, it's also consistency in the message that we're sending out too. So we've been pretty consistent with the premise of the show, and that we beat up and break down topics related to business development. And I think we've maintained a consistent theme that understanding your clients and having a low self-orientation and all of these fundamental components of our message have been very, very consistent.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, like you mentioned, the quantitative aspect. I'd say that this is the qualitative aspect of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Definitely.
So, some other examples of leveraging that mere exposure effect, we've talked about the podcast and how we're doing it. You can also apply this to other aspects of your business development function, prospecting. You could apply it to being visible at events and conferences. And so I think that there's different ways to where you can incorporate repetition and familiarity and being consistent and not running a blitz campaign and then stopping to measure, but making sure that your brand is and your name is visible, whatever direction you pursue or whatever channels you pursue.
Right. You mentioned prospecting, and that's one of the things I focus on with my clients when they're trying to introduce themselves to new prospective clients, likely organizations and people that they don't know and don't know them. We start with this little tiny nugget of familiarity. Maybe it's a connection or a tap on social media. Maybe it's an email that drops into someone's inbox where you're just starting to establish some baseline familiarity with your name, your organization, what you do, what you're interested, what you're focused on, that sort of a thing. So we do these in these little prospecting sequences that we've talked about in the past, are these little 4, 5, 7 touches that lead to an increased level of familiarity to the point, hopefully, where one of these prospects will take you up on your offer for a conversation. So yeah, there's longer term building familiarity like we have done over, where are we, right? 50 plus episodes.
I think so, yeah.
Over many, many months, to these shorter opportunities to build familiarity, maybe in sort of a sprint over the course of a couple of weeks or so, where you go from no one ever heard of you, knows you.
From 0 to 1.
Yeah, 0 to 1. Exactly right. Good stuff.
And it's not just prospecting too. It's not like it's like marketing, build familiarity, prospecting, and then once you get a lead, then you need to stop. I think like synchronous conversations in that sales process all the way through, even beyond closing a new deal into the engagement. It's important to maintain that familiarity, maintain exposure for yourself, just so that you can stay top of mind.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, this is not just a marketing tool. It can be leveraged across that entire sort of marketing and selling continuum that we've referred to in the past, all the way across there, because you constantly need to be establishing and building trust, because a lot of times in professional services, we are asking significant things of our clients.
Yeah.
Right? We're asking them to invest a lot of dollars and cents. We're asking them to invest their time and their resources in us as consultants. Right. So we have to get them to the point where they can make a comfortable, confident buying decision, when it comes down to that dollars and cents and contracting point. And we have to build that trust throughout, because we want our buyers to have a lot of trust in us so they can make a confident decision. And then we need to continue to build it so that they don't experience this kind of, gut-wrenching buyer's remorse. Right. We need to continue to build on that. And we do that constantly, building and reinforcing familiarity across everything we do.
But, Mark, you and I are not experts in behavioral economics or buyer psychology. We apply it to our trades, but we're not experts on this topic. And that's exactly why we've brought in a few guest voices who are experts on these topics. So first up, we have Ryan Paul Gibson, who is the founder of Content Lift. Ryan's story, if you follow Ryan on LinkedIn, you'll always notice that little red balloon that he has in his posts. That's part of his strategy using the mere exposure effect. You'll hear that and more from Ryan. I am joined by Ryan Paul Gibson, founder of Content Lift, or I guess the person who's on the hook for Content Lift. Ryan, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, John. Thanks for having me chat with you.
Yeah, totally. And so we brought you on because we want to have a conversation around this concept that Mark and I are beating up called the mere exposure effect. Mm-hmm. Would love to get your 2 cents on it, your experience with it, kind of looking at the clients that you serve through Content Lift, but also your own experience promoting Content Lift. And you've got a very involved personal brand as part of your strategy. Mm-hmm. So first of all, I think it would be helpful to just kind of provide an overview of Content Lift. Like, what are the services you provide and who do you serve?
So where I fit is really under the umbrella of market research, which sounds so boring. But I love it, and I think it's actually the foundation of business development, and it's maybe a whole other podcast topic. But within market research, I do qualitative research, most all in-depth interviews, so one-on-one conversations, and I do them with customers or in-market buyers to understand, how and why they buy things out of a product category or various options in a market, so I can help marketing and sales teams build more effective go-to-market programs. I really just care about the acquisition side. Like how do we need to talk to a market so we can actually influence them? And so I do all the interviewing and all the qualitative research with a bit of what we call desk research. So, just public information, and I throw it all together and spit out some thoughts on where they can go from here.
And that qualitative research is really important for B2B companies because the total addressable markets are fairly small when compared to like the broader consumer markets.
Oh yeah, that's one part of it. And the second part is, like, if you look at how qualitative research is used in, let's just say, the social sciences, that's the tool they use for understanding complex decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what B2B transactions are.
Exactly.
We often call them like highly considered decisions over less considered decisions. So really good example would be buying a cup of coffee versus buying the manufacturing equipment for a coffee plant, right? Like it's just the broad strokes of how we make choices there are going to be a little different. So
like $5 versus $500,000.
Exactly. So, and to your point, since there's only a small amount of market and there's multiple factors in these decisions, qualitative research is actually often much better than quantitative, like surveys and stuff like that, to understand like how and why people buy.
Totally. I think it's worth underscoring that point for our audience, which is mostly professional services firms. Yeah. And so it's probably even more of a niche for those companies as well, smaller total addressable markets, which means that qualitative research is even more important for that market. So Mark and I want to break down this whole concept of the mere exposure effect. Mm-hmm. And we've got our own kind of definition of it, but I would love to hear in your own words, how would you describe that cognitive bias or that psychological phenomenon?
So how I look at it from a commerce perspective is that people gravitate towards what they're familiar with and understand. Or not even understand, like is in the realm of their contextual understanding. That, if that makes sense. So the mere exposure effect is really, I think at its core, is understanding, how do you leverage that bias in people's brains where they gravitate towards the familiar to then build marketing programs that can be effectively get you to be that brand they're familiar with, right? Over and over again. I hope I answered that okay. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it's really at the core of what marketing does with those first few interactions when we talk into a market. Because if you're not remembered, all the research we've seen over the last 5 decades is you're not going to end up in a consideration set. It's just not going to happen. And people buy what they remember. So it's clutch for understanding like how we need to get in front of people and influence them. There's debates on whether you need a certain number of it's called like touch points or like brand impressions. And I know that 7 is the one, 7, you need 7.
Right.
There's actually a lot of data that suggests that's actually not true. And you can see on LinkedIn, you can see the debates on that. Some people say it's just one. You just need one really good impression to like imprint. What happens though is that our brains start, the memories of that impression start to recede over time, mm-hmm. right? Because new information's coming in. So the exposure effect is like, how do I ensure that I'm just going to re-upping, right? That familiarity, if that makes sense. Because since in B2B specifically, people don't instantly buy right away, and I would know this because all I do is talk to buyers. Right. They have to wait for the conditions to be right, and there's a whole bunch of reasons. And I had a conversation just today to give you an example of how it came into play. But it could be years after someone sees your marketing ad, piece of content, whatever, before they're actually ready to invest in your solution in the B2B world. So how do you stay top of mind within that? How?
Right.
And what do you need to do to stay top of mind? Like, what is it you need to show them? So anyway, I'm just sort of getting ahead of everything, but yeah, it's clutch.
Well, that's a great segue into like what I was gonna like ask you about next is when I go and I'm writing, let's say, hooks for like a LinkedIn post, and I look for inspiration. I always come across that little red balloon that you use
Oh yeah.
in your posts, and every time I see that, I think of Ryan. And I think that's just kind of one example of like the mere exposure effect is you're using that consistently. What are some other like ways that you've leveraged that mere exposure effect in your own marketing of Content Lift?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So that's one of them, and people have actually said that before to me. I look for the red balloon, and that was my conscious thought around it. Was that the other ways that I've done it, to speak to my experience, is again, if we're thinking about just marketing generally and how people buy, people, like I said, people prefer familiarity. They look at things through the contextual lens of what they know. Our brains often, want specificity as opposed to vagueness. Like there's all these things, right? And when I was going out thinking about how I want to promote myself, one of the things you'll see in marketing literature is, you have to niche down. Like people say that in different ways. But why is that? Why is that a thing? Like that's also the reason why we segment. Why? Because the more specific you can be about a certain topic and thing, the easier it is for their brains to understand the familiarity and context of it in this microseconds, the fraction of seconds to see a thing. Because the mere exposure effect doesn't even happen consciously. It ought to happen subconsciously, right? Because our brains have how our brains process information. So I'm going to answer your question. I said, okay, well, what can I talk about over and over again with familiarity that I will be attached to that? Like I will be known as the person who is an authority on that. And it was customer interviews. So I purposely, for the first couple of years on LinkedIn, that's all I talked about every single day was customer interviews. And I know marketers will often struggle with that type of repetition.
Yeah.
But think about how often your target market will be exposed to something out of all the things throughout the course of the day, and within all the things they're being inundated with all the information. So even though I'm repeating the same thing, John, over and over again, and just finding new ways to write it, what that did was about 8 months later, I started to get tagged in posts about, oh, Ryan knows this thing, this one thing. And that was the beginning of it, because what I had done is I'd built familiarity. I had spoken with credibility, so I'd built trust, because that's really what the mere exposure effect helps as well. It helps us build, trust with a brand. And it made that link from like, this is like, I need the information on how to do this. This is where I go to learn how to do it. And I hope that answered the question, but that's how I've really tried to do it.
You're listening to Breaking BizDev,
the podcast that beats up, breaks down, and redefines business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. Your hosts are John Tyerman, founder of Red Cedar Marketing, the podcast marketing company for experts and professional services firms,
and Mark Wainwright, principal consultant and founder of Wainwright Insight, the fractional sales manager and sales consultant to professional services firms.
If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by following the show and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts.
And now, back to the show.
All right, Mark, what did you think of that conversation with Ryan?
Well, above and beyond the content, I just really appreciate his thoughtfulness. I think he understands, calls out, brings to the level of consciousness all this stuff that's kind of going on in our heads, which is always fascinating to me. I think that he understood from the get-go that he needed to be the guy right? I mean, like he was super intentional about creating this visible authority. That's a term we've used a lot, right? Creating this visible authority. So he was not so one of many. He was the, customer insights guy, right? And yeah, he reinforced a lot of the things that we said. He uses a few words in there I thought were good. He uses, you're building familiarity to get to a certain point where your clients will put you in sort of the consideration category, right? Consideration's a term, right? So it's once you cross that line, once they trust you, once you're credible enough, once they understand that you have a certain expertise, then you can be considered, one of the prospective consultants. And without being remembered, without building familiarity, without doing all the work ahead of time, you're just not going to make it to the point of consideration.
Yeah, totally agree. And that was one of the big takeaways that I had too. The other one that I thought was kind of stood out the most to me was when Ryan said that memories of impression fade over time.
Right.
And so the exposure effect re-ups that familiarity.
Yep.
And so that just kind of like reinforces that whole core concept of being consistent with your marketing, being consistent with your sales activities all throughout that customer journey.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, some of this stuff is just screamingly obvious, but if we're not intentional, deliberate about recognizing the importance of it and then sort of building mechanisms in our organizations to establish, maintain familiarity, with current and prospective clients, then it fades over time. And lo and behold, fast forward months, years down the road, it's just we've completely lost track of, even clients that we worked with. It's just those connections have become thready just because we failed at maintaining this familiarity.
Yeah, it's just like growing a garden. Once they get to a certain point, you got to trim, you got to fertilize, you got to tend to it. So,
yeah, I'm a terrible gardener, John. So I just, truth be told, I appreciate the metaphor, but man, yeah, it's a top one for me.
Well, it's springtime here, and my tomato plants are starting to pop up. So
yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, we're in the Pacific Northwest. We have a window of about 8 minutes to grow stuff. So we'll see what happens.
All right. So that was Ryan Paul Gibson. And so I'm glad that we were able to capture his expertise on this topic.
Yeah.
We have one more voice for you listeners out there. And Melina Palmer is the CEO of the Brainy Business. She also hosts a podcast by the same name. And Mark, you turned me on to Melina. I hadn't heard of her. And then you mentioned her to me, and I love her content.
Yeah, she's fantastic. She goes deep.
Yes.
I mean, to call you and I any level of expert when it comes to, behavioral science, behavioral economics, any of that stuff, would be ridiculous compared to the knowledge and the content library that Melina has built in her podcast, in her writing, everything else. Her consulting practice is great. So she does speaking events, everything else. So we all know you have discretionary time to spend on podcasts and other things like that. And we appreciate that you've come to listen to us. But man, if you find a little bit of extra time, go listen to some stuff from Melina. She's fantastic.
Absolutely. So with that said, here comes Melina Palmer on the mere exposure effect. I'd like to start with one that I refer to as the mere exposure effect. It's probably called many different names. Can you share with our audience just the basic principles behind that cognitive bias and then how it could be applied to specifically consultants who are offering a professional service?
Sure. And so, yes, the mere exposure effect is a thing. And there's also similar or other names that you might come across or people might have heard being familiarity bias or the familiarity principle. And so, essentially, what research has found is that the more we are exposed to something, the more likely we are to like it. And that new stuff we're less likely to like. And that's where if you are exposed, though, to the same thing multiple times, you will essentially like it more and more each time. The most common sort of example that gets thrown out for this is if you think about, we all have where there's that new song and the first time you hear it, you hate it. Like, why does anyone like this? This sucks. It's the worst. Turn it off. And then the next time, maybe you listen to a little bit more, and like before you know it, it's totally your jam and you're rocking out to that song forever and you love it and you listen to it again and again on repeat and it's your absolute favorite. And that transition is something that comes from being just essentially exposed to it. And so this applies to all sorts of things. This is where people are likely to fall in love with their best friends or coworkers as you're around people more. And then for brands, where if the first time you see a product, you may not notice or not care about it or think it's weird or dumb. But if you see the same ad multiple times, you're more likely to buy and to feel like, oh yeah, I like this thing. It feels like everybody must have this thing. I know what that is, right? So you want to buy in on whatever that is. So lessons in business. For one, it's easy to feel like I did the pitch and nothing happened and it's over and now I have to do something new and different, and you want to be innovative all the time. But that is not really how our brains work. We like the things that we've seen multiple times. And so don't be too quick to jump and say, well, I said that once and so now I can never say it that way again, or I can't show that ad or that product again, because that doesn't really work with how our brains are aligned. So, stick with it and know that it can have people open up to it, a little bit more over time. And then also just for your own self, as we also have a status quo bias. And so you're going to be looking for the way you've always done things. What feels familiar is something that your brain is wired to like more. And that doesn't mean, though, that it's better than what is outside of it. And so even that example I was giving earlier about on my podcast, where I had a certain way I was doing episodes, and even by episode 7, I'm saying like, but this is how I've done it. And this is what people are used to hearing from me. So I can't change the format. But it feels comfortable, familiar, safe, because I've been exposed to that process before, and that new thing may feel a little bit uncertain. But by switching to that new format, I would say so much growth of the show and how it has built my business came from that shift that I made by being willing to be a little bit uncomfortable and try something new. So helping yourself get out there and try different stuff, even if it feels a little bit awkward or bad or like you're not good at it, know that that can come if you just try it a few more times. So even committing there, like with my podcast, saying I'm going to do it for 6 months or a year before I get to decide if it's working or not, picking a longer term where you can get familiar with it over that, exposure of time can help to really see if there is value in that thing, and just be open to letting go and trying something new though too.
All right, Mark, what were your takeaways from what Melina had to say?
Yeah, we're hitting that nail, John. It's like nothing new, right? She had that one analogy about the song.
I like that one.
That, and I know you're a musician. So yeah, the song thing is that you hear the new song. And for me, it was when I hear the new song from an artist that I really enjoy, and the song isn't immediately comfortable because I think, oh, that's a familiar artist. I think the artist's songs need to sound a particular way, or they need to be a certain thing. And then over time, we get more and more familiar, and lo and behold, we like them more. But the song was the same from day one, John. The song hasn't changed. Right. It's been us that has been changing around the song, because the song stayed the same. To use a Led Zeppelin,
the song remains the same.
Nice. So there you go. So that was wow. That was.
I'm a big Zeppelin fan.
Yeah, I love it. So that was fun. I appreciated that, and we've all likely experienced that. Again, these are Melina and others are experts in taking all these things that are happening behind the scenes in our subconscious and bringing them to light. So she did a good job with that.
Totally. Yep, the song analogy was kind of my big takeaway, and I loved how she made that so relatable to the listeners and everyone out there. I think the big takeaway for me is, give campaigns time enough to build that familiarity, right?
Yeah.
So often do I see professional services firms give a marketing campaign 60 to 90 days, and then they pull the plug before it has a chance to take a hold.
Yeah, good point. And not just pulling the plug on the campaign, John, like just writing off, all marketing in general. They're like, that doesn't work. We just need to get our people in the room to, handshakes and backslaps and close the deal, and they don't spend the time and energy and sort of exercise sufficient patience in order to see these things through. So yeah, good point there.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've sufficiently beaten up this principle and
It's a good one.
Made it readily available and exposed the mere exposure effect for our listeners. Mark, this was a ton of fun. Until next time.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Breaking BizDev. Subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or listen to the show at breakingbizdev.com. This episode was produced by Red Cedar Marketing. If you think a business podcast is right for your company, visit redcedarmarketing.com to learn more.